Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're talking about the greatest one to ever do it, the GOAT, Frank Sinatra, my favorite singer. And I have many, but if I had to just pick one, it would be Frank. And for this video, in celebration of his posthumous birthday, there's no point in rehashing his biography. Everyone's done that a million times, so I'm going to make it personal and talk about my favorite Frank Sinatra albums, which you and yours can listen to because they're all up on Spotify and all the other streaming services. Now, Frank Sinatra's recorded career is typically divided into three parts. There are his early records on Columbia, his early solo recordings. Then there's his Capitol period, which is most of the 50s and very early 60s. And then there's the reprise period because he founded a record label, one of the first musicians to successfully do so, so he could do it his way. Yeah, the puns are here all night. And that took us from the early 60s right up to pretty much the end, if you will. Some exceptions in there, but we'll go with that for now. So without further ado, let me talk about my favorite Sinatra albums in sequential order, beginning with one that happens to be my favorite of all, and this is 1962's Sinatra and Strings, a perfect album. He worked with, of the many great arrangers that he worked with over his career, this one was one where he worked with my favorite of all, Don Costa, who was known for a very lush, romantic, accessible yet complex and sophisticated sound all at once. And as the name implies, there's a large, full string section. The song Yesterdays, the version of that great tune on this album, marvelous, absolutely marvelous. But there isn't a bad track on the album, not one. So if you have to, it's my desert island goated Sinatra album of many. So it's my favorite of all. Next is an album that's a bit less well known in the catalog in terms of it didn't sell quite as much as some of the others, but it really should have. And this has another great arranger involved, the wonderful, wonderful Gordon Jenkins. And this is the album All Alone, also from 62. It was a very good year for Frank Sinatra. I know the puns, I kind of walked into that one, but what a great album. Again, not a bad track on the title track is great. He has a great version of What'll I Do, a great version of When I Lost You, a great version of Remember. Just a wonderful, wonderful album with a wonderful arranger. And one theme that you might notice about this discussion of Sinatra is that I think that the best Sinatra songs were the ballads and the more melancholic ones and the more conceptual ones. His happy songs, of course, are wonderful, but I actually think that while some, not all, but some of his happy songs date Sinatra a bit, his ballads, his more conceptual songs, his more melancholic songs are really super timeless. Another album that isn't one of my top favorites, but still really good, is Softly as I Leave You from 64. The song Emily, the first song on the album, really, really good. The title track also very good. So not one of the best albums, but a good one nevertheless. Now, one that is definitely in my top three, if not top two. In fact, I'll say top two. Just after Sinatra and Strings, barely after, so close. And this is September of My Years, Gordon Jenkins doing the arrangement, a concept album. As I've said on a previous video, Frank Sinatra in many ways invented the concept album. And if not that, certainly the concept of the concept album. Now, this obviously features It Was a Very Good Year, one of many signature songs that you could assign to Sinatra, but there are so many great ones on this one. The September of My Years, the title track, wonderful. How Old Am I? Wonderful. September Song, wonderful. Again, not a bad track on the album, a concept album in the best sort of way, as is another album that I'm quite fond of, Moonlight Sinatra, by another great arranger that Sinatra worked with a lot, Nelson Riddle. The theme here is moonlight, and of course, there's the wonderful song Moon Love, which is based on the third movement of, or rather the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. And so basing a song around Tchaikovsky can never really do you wrong. Not the Again, not in my top three or anything, but again, a really good album. You can't go wrong. You have to put Strangers in the Night from 66 on the album because just when people were kind of sort of starting to think that his hit single days were behind him, bam, he hits them with Strangers in the Night. Summer Wind and All or Nothing at All. A fast version, there's a slow ballad version of All or Nothing at All on Sinatra and strings, but again, really, really good. He has a wonderful version of the song Downtown, the one from Petula Clark and later Seinfeld fame. Can't go wrong there. Now we get to the final sort of 12-ish years of Sinatra's career, when in the late 60s, some people thought that Sinatra was finished, but I actually think he had an Indian summer and that some of his very best stuff came in the sort of final 12 years or so of his career, beginning with a 68 album called Cycles, which again produced and arranged by the great Don Costa. And here we see that we're now in an era of Sinatra music that's firmly in the rock and roll era. Rock and roll and its associated singer and songwriter movements are the dominant form of pop music, the dominant idiom that is influencing pop music. And Frank Sinatra is not immune to that. In fact, he embraced modernity. Far from a curmudgeon, he was really one who was receptive to modern music. The comparatively contemporary song Little Green Apples, he did a wonderful version of on this album, Cycles. By the Time I Get to Phoenix, by the wonderful Jimmy Webb, Gentle on My Mind, wonderful version of that. Absolutely extraordinary. It was around this time that he also had another unexpected hit, in the age of the late 60s. This is when The Doors and Jimi Hendrix were doing their thing. It was the year that King Crimson and Led Zeppelin and Jethro Tull and Yes had their first album. But in 1969, we had the album My Way, which of course has that song. It also has Simon and Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson, Yesterday by the Beatles, Didn't We by Jimmy Webb, Hallelujah, I Love You So, I Love Her So, Ray Charles. So it's an album that, again, really contemporary, and you have to put it on the list because, of course, you do. Sticking with this period, we're now into the early 70s, and you've got Sinatra and Company, which is divided between Brazilian music that was done in collaboration with a frequent collaborator, Antonio Carlos Jobim. Shout out to the first major full album collaboration, Francis Albert Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim. This album, of course, also has a B-side, as all albums do, and that's with Don Costa coming back to do the arrangements, and you've got Being Green, the Muppet song, and what a beautiful version. Along with Van Morrison, I think Sinatra's is absolutely the best. You've got Leaving on a Jet Plane, the John Denver song, again, very modern, very contemporary. And it is a wonderful album, both the stuff with Antonio Carlos Jobim and the more westernized, or I can't say because Brazil, but Americanized, if you will, stuff with Don Costa. After a brief retirement, Old Blue Eyes came back in 73. Don Costa was there waiting for him. And again, on this album, Old Blue Eyes is back. You've got a lot of modern music. Nobody Wins by Chris Christopherson. Send in the Clowns, modern comparatively at the time, by Stephen Sondheim. He did a wonderful version of that. A really good album that welcomed him back, but an even better one is the follow-up album, Some Nice Things I Missed, which had a number of arrangers, including Don Costa. What Are You Doing the Rest of My Life? Wonderful song. If by Bread, who I recently did a video on. Great. You Are the Sunshine of My Life. Stevie Wonder. Again, we're really modern. Sweet Caroline, Neil Diamond. And of course, he sings all of these really well. Bad, Bad Leroy Brown. How could you miss out on that one? And in fact, just going back to Old Blue Eyes is back. One of the best, I would say, maybe one of my top three Sinatra songs on Old Blue Eyes is back from 73. Let Me Try Again, the Paul Anka version. He was the one who wrote this Americanized English language version. And again, it's one of the tear jerkers from Sinatra's late career. And then from 1981, what turned out to be the final collaboration with Don Costa, you've got She Shot Me Down. Really, really good album. You have Gordon Jenkins also doing some arrangements of some songs, as with Nelson Riddle. Wonderful album. And then what I would consider sort of his final fully fledged album was, of course, one that brought him back into contact with Quincy Jones. And this was 1984's LA Is My Lady, which saw the first time you had synthesizers, electronic drum sounds, the sounds of the 80s with Frank Sinatra, not something that you typically think of, nor do you think think of Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth being in your music video, but they sure were. And I think it's a fitting way to go out because in the early 80s, the Quincy Jones sound, the Michael Jackson sound that is part of the Quincy Jones sound, was the big thing. And Sinatra embraced it while also bringing back some of the big band stuff because Quincy Jones, of course, did and could do everything. And so that's a summary of some of my favorite albums from the reprise years of Frank Sinatra, the years when he, again, did it his way. He is the king. He is well, Elvis is the king, but Sinatra is the goat. What a voice, the phrasing, the tonality, the enunciation. I'll say the tonality again because it's so, so good. And those are just some of my favorite Sinatra songs. But the great thing about the Sinatra catalog is that there's something for everyone, and that's life. Another good one, by the way. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.